We had a patient go into her pediatrician's office and she said, I'm just not sure about these yet. My kid's got this allergy and that problem and this allergy, and I'd like them to be, exempted for a while we see how these things play out. And he basically said, if you don't vaccinate, we're going to kick you out of the practice. So either vaccinate or you're leaving now. I mean, just like that. And she says, well, I'm not going to vaccinate. And he says, fine, you're kicked out. And he grabbed what he thought was the patient's file and he threw it at her, right? And so she goes to opening up this file. It actually was the file for his financial payoffs and incentives for vaccinating a certain percentage in his practice, right? Not only incentive plan, but his earnings.
You're kidding.
$140,000, $1,400,000, or about $1,400,000, I guess I remember generally, but it was more than $1 million, okay, in terms of incentives. So you're like, wow, that really is happening, right? It's not just a rumor. I mean, you got an example of it.
Welcome to the Alix Mayer Show. Have you ever thought that California schools are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act? You're right, they're not. But the California law about medical exemptions actually conflicts with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today's guest is Dr. Bill Lionberger. He's an ADA evaluator, a chiropractor, a mounted officer. He was security for Sylvester Stallone, and he's also one of the pioneers of the ADA waiver to vaccinations, so children in California can go to school without vaccinations if they've been injured by them before, or if parents think that the children are at high risk of being injured by further vaccination. Think of this episode as a toolkit for you as you might go through this process with your own child. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with what you think about the content of this episode. I think you're really going to enjoy today's show. The Alix Mayer Show is sponsored by MISH International, gold and silver specialists since 1963. When you need protection from monetary inflation and leveraged assets exposure, you contact the dedicated people at MISH International. MISH International, a family business, offers true expertise, integrity, reliability, and fair pricing of gold and silver. Visit their website at mishinternational.com. That's MISH international.com. Hey folks, I'm here with Del Bigtree on the set of The Highwire.
Hey, good to see you.
And Del, you're coming to Silicon Valley this fall, aren't you?
I am. I think a lot about it. The last fundraiser I did with you, we did like 2 different nights.
I had 5 couples come up to me and say that you saved their marriage.
Oh, good.
I had a PA and a nurse say that you totally changed their minds, and that creates waves.
Yeah, it really does. If you want to get to a great fundraiser, is doing great work. Free Now Foundation, I love the work that you guys are doing. California can get really testy. You're the most oppressed state in America, but you're actually starting to make some headway. We're seeing some of the original authors of SB 277 wondering if they've made the right decision.
And I have to say, California is the worst state in the country for medical freedom. There's a medical exemption on the books, but it doesn't function. It's designed to fail. So we have no options for children to go to school in California without vaccines. But there is so much hope. Free Now Foundation, we have 2 lawsuits. One of them would totally end the need for exemptions. There's a lot of stuff happening in California, and I think we're going to see a lot of progress over the next year or 2, and things are going to change dramatically.
Well, look, you want to get involved, and I'm going to be speaking at this fundraiser September 12th in Silicon Valley. Free Now Foundation, where do we go to sign up or be a part of that?
Go to freenowfoundation.org and you can sign up for the fundraiser. You can get to meet Del in person, get a picture with him, ask your questions. We always have a robust Q&A. It is going to be a good time. Margaritas, organic tacos, and all of your medical freedom friends.
Absolutely. I'll see you there.
Me too. Dr. Bill Lionberger, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the Alix Mayer Show.
Well, I'm excited to be here, Alex. It's a great day to be on your show, and I'm excited for today's topic and what we're going to be able to chat about.
This is a really exciting and breakthrough topic, and I don't think people really understand all the ways in which this waiver that you've developed is working. But I want to take us back before you even developed this ADA waiver and talk a little bit about your background, because I know that you're a chiropractor, you're a police officer, and you've got a whole lot of things in your background that just make me feel like you're James Bond.
It's interesting. For some reason, I sort of hit on an area of interest, which was the forensic side of my profession. And I looked into what is it going to take to be a forensic expert. I was doing personal injury work and kind of the general practice work, but I really enjoyed, the PI side of things. And so I began to really search it out and learn that there were very few people, if any, that actually, specialized in that. So I thought, okay, what do I need to get here? What do I need to learn? What do I need to have for credentials? And so I went about that task, and I studied, Melvin Belli and many of the other authors of the time to learn about that. And so I became an industrial disability evaluator and examiner. I was among one of the first, actually, I think the first graduating class in the workers' comp system in California for qualified medical examiners. I became a medical examiner for the state of Hawaii eventually. And so I spent probably more than 15 years in forensics, teaching judges, juries, and attorneys, in the various areas that I was involved in, and learning and becoming better at the world of forensics and expert witnessing. And among all of that was disability evaluation and examination. And the kind of the core footing for that is you find it in the workers' comp system, because in the workers' comp system, there's a lot of rules and regulations on how you do lots of things, and there's charting and lots of ways that you work to get through that. It's complicated, it's not easy work, but that kind of led into where we find us today. And then at the beginning, that's a little bit about the sort of the forensic background. I have some history in law enforcement. I spent 15 years so far as an active duty police officer, and I just love it. It's a 0 to 100 kind of experience. It's different than the mental side of taking care of patients and evaluating and things like that. But it's another area of service that I enjoy. And among that, I eventually became a general instructor to teach at the academy, and became mount certified tech rescue for mountain rescue and all the fun stuff that we like to do where you can do it. So anyway, a lot of interesting things along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you were a mounted police officer for a while also, right? And you were a bodyguard for Sylvester Stallone for a time?
Way back, in the exiting college days, I was, in law enforcement. I had a big history of martial arts and things like that, and got a lucky break with someone who was in that industry, and they got me an intro, and I got hired, and I worked there for almost 4 years. So it was quite an amazing time, and we could have some fun talking about those stories.
We have in the past, but I'm going to fast forward us to how all of these skill sets that you've developed across a lifetime came together when we got locked down and you saw a really big problem with the COVID shot mandates, right?
Well, yeah, when we began to see this roll out, before I became actually one of the original America's Frontline Doctors, I actually signed on and was part of the doctor corps that could sign in to San Diego County, the 8th largest big county in the country. And I was able to listen to their stories and their communications and the way that they were telling everybody to function and operate. And a lot of red flags started coming out listening to those meetings, and especially when you ask questions and you're not getting the answers, and you can tell that the whole thing starts to feel like a ruse that didn't fit the stories at all. And that's back when we had the masking and all of that kind of thing, right?
What tipped you off that this was definitely a ruse? Like you probably saw a few signs, and then there was probably one point where you just went over the cliff and you're like, okay, this is a ruse.
Well, there's a long list, but the first ones were, we had a very robust practice in California. I think we were seeing over 5,000 patients, and we didn't have any what they called COVID patients. We didn't have anybody hardly even having what we call flu-like symptoms. I mean, we didn't have nothing fit the parameters. And I began to reach out to some other practitioners and say, are you seeing this like I'm seeing this? And the answers came back, we're not seeing a spike in anything. Okay, they're telling us where these masks don't work and no spikes. Okay, so that was really, I think, one of the first things that said to me, hey, something's off here.
That's what started to tip you off. And then these mandates came down for the COVID shots, and you realized that people didn't really have any outs in the workplace. Or did you realize that the schools in California that had illegally mandated the COVID shots, that was the first problem to tackle? Where did you start trying to help people with the mandates?
So it's a really good question, Alex. Let's go back to the basics of the state for a minute, okay? So in the state, those of us that are primary healthcare practitioners, we have a situation. Little Johnny comes into the office, sprains his ankle, right? And there's no real mandated process by the state, this is the state process, etc. We just, as doctors, would write a paragraph, exempt that patient, that little Johnny, from exercise for so many weeks. They'd hand that over to the coach and the teacher. They'd all go, yeah, and they'd bow and say, yeah, we're going to follow the doctor's recommendations, right? And that's kind of what everybody was used to, is the basic program that didn't require a whole lot of oversight and direction, because we're doctors and we're supposed to be able to do that. We're the ones that are supposed to do that. And so people began to question and ask, well, if we don't want this mandated injection, what can we do because we don't trust it, right? That was that has grown tremendously, but that was also the question in the beginning. We don't trust it, so what can we do? Well, we'll just write an exemption to it, and just like we do little Johnny sprained ankle, and we did. And so for most of 2020, we were just writing the usual program. We didn't need anything special to handle that, right? Then along comes CAIR-ME, CDPH CAIR-ME program, January 1st of 2021. And all of a sudden now we have a mandate of what you can and can't do because we want to track you, etc. Now, along the way, what we had also seen was some other practitioners thought like me and were writing medical exemptions, because I was doing it as a disability evaluator, a disability examiner, but somebody with credentials, as a primary healthcare provider, and there weren't any pushback, problems, issues. I mean, not one that I can remember.
And you're talking about the CAIR-ME system for school attendance, what I like to call the anti-vaxxer database.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. This was before that launched.
Okay.
And then we began to see that the regular practitioners, the MDs and DOs within that allopathic system, were starting to get censored. They were getting letters of reprimand. They were being told they can't participate in writing a medical exemption. This was before CAIR-ME. And then some of their licenses were being challenged and taken away. And there starts that whole, merry-go-round, if you will, of doctors, going, what is going on here? I mean, all of a sudden, my state association has decided to step in the park with pharma and then come after me because I'm just trying to write this medical exemption because I think I've got all these reasons why, right? Or maybe they're vaccine injured already from prior vaccines or other. And so, that was kind of what was also bringing up the red flags in 2020 before the 2021 CAIR-ME.
Got it. Okay. And so in 2021, I can't remember what month it was, but the California schools then illegally mandated the COVID shots. And they didn't have the authority to do that because the principal doesn't have the authority, the superintendent doesn't have the authority, the entire Department of Education doesn't have the authority. It's only the legislature or the Department of Public Health. And so is that when you sprang into action, when those COVID shots were unlawfully mandated onto school children?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have the authority from the beginning. They thought they did under the emergency use authorization. But even if you looked at the military, right, the military said it had to be an approved, vaccine, using their terminology, and it wasn't approved. Comirnaty never did get, they did the bait and switch, and so that created all kinds of issues through the whole military. Same kind of thing. Again, we're trying to sell you one thing when it's another thing, right?
Exactly. I remember.
So, but not everybody was blind to that. People were starting to pick up on that, and the momentum began to grow. And that was also a driver for me to be part of the America's Frontline Doctors and the first groups with the target, who are willing to speak out to say, this doesn't make sense. Where's the science? Okay, we're looking at the patents. We're looking at the background information. We can do that, and it doesn't match. Okay, so where are the double-blind studies that says this is safe, right?
Exactly.
Which didn't exist.
Oh, so you stepped out with America's Frontline Doctors at that time with Simone Gold and Dr. Jeff Barkey, who's on our board. And yeah, we all remember that vividly when you bravely stepped out altogether. That was a huge moment in lockdowns. It gave all of us so much hope that something was going to happen, that all these credentialed doctors like you had stepped out and spoken up. And I think we got this false sense of hope so many times, but that was a really big one because we thought, wow, here you all are together. The authorities can't possibly argue with you, but they did.
So we needed to make a shift. When we saw the CAIR-ME and the doctors, what we didn't see in the CAIR-ME was, let's see, it's a long tunnel. When you look at actually the CAIR-ME now, I don't know, is there 18, 20 things you've got to do to try to actually get into the funnel? It's a lot of, red tape, right? But we weren't seeing anybody sign up as doctors for the most part. They didn't want to go near it. They didn't want to lose their licenses. And we didn't see anybody coming out the other end of that funnel with an intact medical exemption to vaccination that was working.
Right.
So let's see, you've created this funnel to track the patients, to track the doctors, but you don't have a process because it wasn't built for that, right?
Exactly.
It was built for something else.
So tell everybody what happens when a doctor enters a medical exemption into the anti-vaxxer database called CAIR-ME. What happens after that?
Well, it's a tracking system, and they freely admit it on their website. It's partly for tracking, and then they can keep track of how many the doctor writes, if he's willing to put his name in there. There's the imaginary number of how many he writes before he gets letters from the state board that, you're now being tracked because you're writing something we don't want you to write. Before they got the letters were coming after your license, right? So this was another way to fully track that and then really clamp down. The doctors really got the message that they didn't want to participate because they had heard of so many colleagues that, either got censored or really were losing licenses. So they didn't want to play. But another thing also shifted with CAIR-ME that I was aware of, and that was the payoffs. So they began to shift. They began to shift the incentive programs onto the doctors, saying, well, if we don't want them to all lose their license or have a big problem with that, so let's just pay them more money. Let's pay them off for a higher percentage of vaccines. Okay,
really,
the vaccination of their practice.
Wait, so you're telling me, I didn't know this. So there were incentive programs that were implemented around 2021 to further incentivize doctors to vaccinate. And did those incentive programs come from the insurance company or from the Department of Public Health?
Well, I became aware of this because of the flow that we have with the number of patients that we see. And here's an example. We had a patient go into her pediatrician's office, had kids in there for a number of years. And she said, I'm just not sure about these yet. And my kid's got this allergy and that problem and this allergy, and I'd like them to be, exempted for a while while we see how these things play out. And he basically said, if you don't vaccinate, we're going to kick you out of the practice. So either vaccinate or you're leaving now. I mean, just like that. And she says, well, I'm not going to vaccinate. If you're going to kick me out, and he says, fine, you're kicked out. And he grabbed what he thought was the patient's file and he threw it at her, right? This is her telling me what happened. And so she gets out and she goes to opening up this file. It actually was the file for his financial payoffs and incentives for vaccinating a certain percentage in his practice, right? We have a copy of that in our
wow.
records now.
So he threw what he thought was the medical chart for her kids at her in frustration and anger because she wouldn't vaccinate. And it ended up being the wrong folder, and it contained his incentive plan for vaccination.
It was in his entire, not only incentive plan, but his earnings.
You're kidding.
$140,000, about $1,400,000, I guess I remember generally, but it was more than $1 million, okay, in terms of incentives, with all of the breakdown. And, so you're like, wow, that really is happening, right? It's not just a rumor. I mean, you got an example of it. And then we saw the incentives coming from Blue Cross, Blue Shield, and those began to surface, over time. And, the timing of that is a bit muddled, but it's there now. It's an incentive for the pediatricians. And, as everybody seems to know more now, the pediatricians really wouldn't be busy and have any practice if they didn't have the vaccine schedule, right?
That's right.
And yet if you ask them details about it, most of them don't go very deep in terms of information. They just follow it blindly almost.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, you can ask a waiter what are the ingredients in your food, and they know more about that than your pediatrician knows about what's in a vaccine.
Exactly.
It's ridiculous. Okay, so this was the folder throwing incident that I just love that story. I mean, what a bozo of a doctor. So yeah, so it's really obvious that these doctors are being incentivized. And then did you also find out that they are being incentivized by CARES Act funds to push the COVID shots as well?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about all the funding sources, but if those carriers are making money, in all the different ways that they do, obviously the CARE funds are making their way through the system, right? They drove those carriers to the tune of over $300 million. It was like some huge number over the years. It was really huge. And so, it was finding its way through. But I think that what they did was they actually came to a place like they did with CAIR-ME. They said, well, what else can we do here to keep these doctors and keep them on our side? Let's just pay them more money,
Exactly.
Simpler problem.
It's so sick, these perverse incentives to do the wrong thing. It's just gross.
Right.
Dr. Bill, I just found out that a hospital in New York called Northwell is the defendant now in a lawsuit for killing a mentally disabled girl who was 27 with these protocols. In fact, she had 5 times more fentanyl in her system than George Floyd when she died. They got paid in advance of having their COVID patients. They got paid $1.2 billion just for one hospital system in New York from the CARES Act. And that was just for 2020.
Yeah.
And then they had to promise they would implement the COVID protocols just to be able to keep those funds. Otherwise, they were going to have to send the funds back. So all these incentives were turning otherwise, caring professional people into monsters.
Well, what do they call it? The standard of care, right? Who's setting the standard of care? When we look back at the hospitals, as everybody seems to have a handle on now, the flu didn't disappear, right? It was renamed. You don't see one graph go down and one go up, and they're proportional, and it's just mathematically pretty much impossible.
Right.
But the data points are unmistakable about really what happened.
So, Dr. Bill, you don't think COVID cured the flu?
No, actually, the symptoms that we call the flu are probably something completely different than an industry that's built around curing it.
I'm with you. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, we're looking at something completely different, but that's what that industry's built on. But when you go back and you study it and you look at it, you learn that it's not the way that they taught it. It's not the way they teach it. Washing hands was the biggest improvement that we saw in decades that made a difference in human health by far than almost any of the other things that they talk about. But I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the shift into when we looked at the ADA and how that came about.
Yeah, let's go there. So we have this huge problem with vaccine mandates in schools. In 2021, the screws had come down and they established this database for the first time where the medical exemptions, instead of being more informal and submitted to the school, they've got to go into a database, and then the Department of Public Health looks at all these medical exemptions and decides without examining the patient if they're valid. And of course, they've decided that almost every single one that I know of is invalid. So you see a problem here because you're really familiar with the ADA, and the law that established this database is silent on the ADA. Can you talk about that?
So back when there was a shift to the CAIR-ME program, where we saw that they were shifting to try to do everything that they could, in especially the captured California state, to clamp down on practitioners doing their job, which is to help their patients where they need to and how they need to, and get in the middle of healthcare, right, and decide that they're smarter than the doctors and they're going to, mandate that. We decided that we needed to have a more powerful tool, and as a medical examiner, a disability examiner, myself, and we're like, well, we could just shift to the ADA and look at that as the bigger bear, the bigger tool to really throw it off balance, because they hadn't planned on it. They hadn't thought about it by our experience over the last 6 years. And they've tried to play some catch up here and there, but it's hard to play catch up when the laws are so powerful on your side. And so I got with disabled rights advocates, attorneys, and we built the better mousetrap, if you will, utilizing the ADA. So, yeah.
And how did you know it was more powerful than the medical exemption law in California? Can you explain the ADA to people?
Sure. When you come back to the early days where you're writing a little sprained ankle for little Johnny, right? It's not really very organized. What stands behind it? Just your license, and you're going to write a thing, right? And then what got in the way of it? All of a sudden, CAIR-ME gets in the way of doing the basic thing, right? But what do they have on their side? I mean, what do they really have? They have a state that's trying to clamp down on doctors. On the federal side, you have a whole different cadre of support. You have the U.S. Department of Labor, okay, for work situations, the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of EEOC. You have the Supreme Court and its renderings about the efficacy and the power and veracity of the ADA and its laws and its segments of laws over time, okay? And then you have congressional mandates that came in 2008. And so I wanted to just kind of address it for a minute, because where did all this come from? So in 1973, Section 504 was passed. 504 was the Rehabilitation Act, and it's a federal law prohibiting discrimination against individuals with disabilities in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. 1973. What came next? The IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education, passed. Now that's on top of the other one, and with it. So in 1975, this is for Education for All Handicapped Children Act, EHA, and known as the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the things that came with that act. Then what happened? In 1990, the ADA was passed. So in 1990, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in various areas of public life. Now, we have the aha moment of the power now just arrived, okay? Because with the ADA in 1990, all of a sudden, we're dealing with civil federal rights against discrimination, and that changes the whole parameter, if you will. And then finally, we're dealing with the 2008 amendments to that, and those came about for a multitude of reasons, and then that further augmented and changed the ADA so that it expanded it. The reason that they needed to do that was because even though the Supreme Court after 2008 was supportive of the ADA, before that it was actually closing down rights. So it made it harder to be basically qualified at disabled under the ADA. Congress said, no, that's not gonna stand. We're gonna override all of those and come in with amendments now and expand the types of conditions, expand access, who can write for those, which is a key factor in what we do. So that's a little bit of a kind of a history lesson, if you will, of how it came together.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the ADA was passed in 1990, and they were trying to make it more narrow until 2008, and when the amendment went through. And then in 2008, it's my understanding that the definition of a disability became any condition that's lasted longer than 6 months. Is that right, Dr. Bill?
Well, no, it's much more. There's so much more to the law than that. That's just one piece it's one way to get in there, okay? Potentially, but that's not a bar that you have to overcome with all the other ways that you qualify and can qualify under the ADA. So
I see.
There's a lot.
So, my wrinkles probably wouldn't qualify, even though they've lasted more than 6 months.
Right, that probably wouldn't cut it, and but there might be ways around it. They really wanted to lower the bar so that the most vulnerable class would have access and not have an impediment to access to that mechanism through the ADA and its civil rights protections against discrimination, okay, which is, again, the focal point with that 2008 piece, and also 1990, but this then further changed all of that.
We know so many of our listeners understand the relationship between health freedom and our personal and economic freedoms. It's the same principle. If you're one of our audience who's concerned about inflation, paper asset crises, and ongoing monetary crises, you may have already started accumulating gold and silver or are considering doing so. There's no gold dealer we know who's better positioned to serve the freedom community than Mish International in Menlo Park, California. I'm one of the many happy customers who's purchased gold or silver in their showroom, or I've had it delivered through their secure courier service. They are true veterans who are honest, fair, and reliable, and so knowledgeable regarding all the choices of gold and silver bars and coins to help you choose the products that fit your goals and your worldview. The principal, Robert Mish, is world-renowned for his expertise in rare coins as well. Write down this number, 650-324-9110. That's 650-324-9110. And visit mishinternational.com. That's MISH international.com to learn more about this notable company. Do you ever wonder what my foundation, Free Now Foundation, really does? It turns out that after all the articles and videos that I do, that a lot of people still wonder what we really do. We're California's leading medical freedom nonprofit, but did you know we're the only group in California trying to end the medical mandates so children can go to school safely in California? And what does that mean? People don't get this, but it means there's no need for an exemption if there's no mandate. We won't need a religious exemption. We won't need a medical exemption. We won't need any type of exemptions anymore because parents will just be able to say no. No is a complete sentence. And Free Now Foundation is going to stay in the courts and do this legal strategy, pursue it as long as it takes until parents call the shots again in California and beyond, and parents can just say a simple no. So if you share this vision of a world where we don't have medical mandates, where children do not need an exemption of any sort to go to school, and this work calls to you, please consider supporting us at Free Now Foundation, freenowfoundation.org. That's spelled FREENOW foundation.org, and make a donation today. Okay, so you knew that the ADA, being a federal law, had much more power and weight than any state vaccine mandate law. So that birthed this new idea of the ADA waiver. Can you talk about the beginning of that?
Yeah, so again, back to the ADA itself. So the mechanisms were already in place. The states also have ADA type of laws as well in the books. But having those things already in place means that you have all of those mechanisms on your side, basically protecting you and your civil rights against discrimination. And so, it was a natural for us to go, okay, we're gonna weave this together. And it wasn't hard because that's what we do. But at the end of the day, the process is really powerful. And it's been very successful over now 6 years because you have facilities that they're already in compliance. Many have ADA coordinators, like many of the hospitals and teaching institutions are supposed to have by law. They're already compliant in many, many areas. So then the idea of discrimination really has power because you're not building something, it's already built. You're just showing up to the party saying, it's not Sally Sue with a wheelchair today. It's, Dave over here that needs a medical exemption, check the box. And you don't have an out because the one out that you had was going to be the cost. And so it's not going to cost you $50,000 to get Sally Sue in there or Dave because basically you're not going to have to build something. So the protections that are for you really don't exist, which means the protections are there for the injured and the disabled. So what's it going to cost you to check that box? Nothing. And the process by which they can challenge it, it's already laid out. It's already there. You want to challenge it? You got to do this, you got to do this, and you got to follow a process. But first you have to have somebody that knows it. That means you have to have an ADA coordinator. Most people are in violation across the board or don't have somebody who's very well educated in that regard.
And by that, you mean that the schools with a certain number of employees must have an ADA coordinator, and that's really the only legal decision maker for an ADA waiver from vaccination, right?
Right. If you were going to look at religious schools, it's 15. If you were going to look at teaching institutions and things like that, it's 50.
Okay.
But, you have to have a certain number of employees, just without getting into all of the detail. And then you're required. It's not a maybe so. You're required to have that coordinator because navigating the law and accommodating for many of the disabilities requires intelligence. It requires understanding what you need to accommodate for. How does that work? How do we stay in compliance so we're not putting ourselves out of compliance and then we can be in violation, and then all of these entities and these people can come after us, if they so choose. And you're not protected as a bad employee for making bad decisions. You can be sued individually under the 2008 amendments. Also, what's interesting is, in addition to protecting the injured, they protect the providers because they don't want the providers to be singled out and say, well, you're helping, now we're going to come after you with everything we've got because we don't want to comply.
Oh, I didn't realize that. And that's the opposite of this CAIR-ME system where the provider is more at risk writing a medical exemption, but it's the opposite with an ADA waiver. They're more protected as a medical practitioner writing an ADA waiver.
Right.
That's interesting.
And for the practitioner, because they changed the definition of who actually can do these, healthcare practitioner is then defined to allow all the other types of practitioners to weigh in and be part of the system. So it's not just, a select group of MD, DO, whomever that can actually do this work. They expanded all of that so that there's a much greater access, and since there's a much greater level and kind of condition that you can apply to this.
That's amazing because, there's so many brilliant things about this ADA waiver in the context of the California medical exemption law. And one of them is that the medical exemption law says that it has to be a medical doctor or a doctor of osteopathy, a DO. Those are the only two types of doctors who can write a medical exemption. And
does that sound discriminatory?
Yeah, absolutely, and that doesn't jive with disability rights law. But also the other parameter in California, according to that law, is that it has to be a California-based medical doctor or DO. And so, can you explain what other types of medical practitioners can write an ADA waiver, and if they need to be in California or not?
Well, a healthcare practitioner under the 2008 amendments is somebody who basically comes to the table with a medical background, a healthcare background, licensed, it can be all the other types of practitioners, DCs, MDs, DOs, RNs, PAs, NPs, as a short list. You could have, optometrists, you could have all kinds of doctors, especially in the specials where there may be something that relates to their specialty, who can then come in and opine and make a rendering in terms of what they see and help get somebody qualified. And so under the ADA, you have to make a statement, then you have to make a request. If I'm saying this person is disabled and they need something under the current system, I'm going to make a request. Whether it's I need a wheelchair access for this person or I need an ADA waiver to vaccination, I have to make a request. And then there's a process once they get a request that their side, if they follow the procedure, which is already baked in, is supposed to do, to follow the federal law to provide the accommodation for the request that was made by that healthcare practitioner, okay? And if they want to deviate from that, then there's another procedure that they must follow to be in compliance with the law, but it's all on the side of the disabled and the injured. It's not on the side of them. It's in there so that it puts really the hard sell on their side. So explain again why it is that you're not going to follow the accommodation here, and then go through the list of why, put it down there, and that doesn't mean they're going to get their request to deny you, okay? So we haven't hardly seen, I think, a couple of those that sort of tried to do that in 6 years, because they're not set up to follow the system. They're set up to go, well, it's their ADA. I got to do a thing, so I'm going to do a thing. Why would you start discriminating against vaccines now?
Right.
Since you've been following the system really well for a long time, since 2008, right? It's a long time.
That's a great point.
Why would all of a sudden change?
There's so much inconsistency in people who think that they don't discriminate. I remember, Dr. Bill, when we were locked down, we, as Children's Health Defense California chapter, which was the original name of Free Now Foundation, we made a poster for restaurant owners and business owners to put in their window. It said, "We do not discriminate." And, it had the normal things like age, race, disability, blah, blah, blah. But then it said masking status and vaccine status. And they would nod their head and say, "Oh, yeah, we can put this in our window." They're reading it. They then get to the bottom and they saw masking status and vaccine status. They're like, "Oh, we can't put this in our window." And they don't even realize that they have a double standard, that they do discriminate. And it's the same thing with the medical exemption law here. And suddenly vaccines are the one thing where they can discriminate. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, we could take it further. Also, one of the things that they've also tried to do, which is not lawful, which is, okay, so if we give you let's see now, you're a nursing student and you're going to go through clinicals, right? And we see them every week. We take care of them every week, right? and we're going to make you a mask, and we're going to make you test, like you have a scarlet letter every day and every week. Just shove that thing up your nose, and you know what I mean? And that is also, trying to violate their civil rights as well. And, what if they have an exemption to that, which we can handle? Because there can be problems with masking. What if you're claustrophobic? What if you have all kinds of other issues related to masking besides the fact that there's no science to prove it works? They don't even consider that, right?
Exactly.
Or the testing, and what about the bad chemicals in there that you could be allergic to that you shouldn't be putting in your, up your nose or wherever. So, there's a lot more to the discrimination than just that. They'll sometimes use these other things like, really, do you really want to do that? Because you're really holding out a red flag on how you're discriminating and putting yourself in harm's way, potentially with a legal suit, i.e. something is happening in California, right?
Very much. So let's talk about this ADA waiver that you've developed based on all these principles we've just been talking about. And you've basically pulled together all the resources into one place to make this a one-stop shop for people and help them push this through at schools who normally knee-jerk and think like everything's got to go through CAIR-ME, but this doesn't. Can you tell us about this?
Well, when you're not involved in the Kleenex terminology, a medical exemption in the state, because they all kind of know that, right? We're not involved in state processes and procedures in that terminology at all. In fact, it's not found in any of the writings of the work that we do. Now, there are similarities in that you're being exempted from something for a different set of reasons or some very similar medical reasons, right? But the law is very, very different. The law is loaded with data and information. And so the attorneys that are experts in this, we work very hard at educating the other side because they are not very good at knowing federal law. They're not very good at understanding their responsibilities. So we kind of give them an A to Z sort of overview, if you will, of what's your job here, okay? When you're being presented with this, what's your job? Your job is to do this and this and this. And that is the legal side. And the medical team that are experts in understanding, we deal with vaccine injured people all the time. They come in and I've had this vaccine or that vaccine and it gave me this problem and that problem. And I just don't ever want to see another one because I'm afraid I'm going to be the next person that has anaphylactic shock or whatever. But when you put the two together, you put the expertise of those together into a document, you have pretty much the 1-2 punch, especially when one's built out of the law and one's built out of the pharma side. Mm-hmm. The side that they don't put in the blank insert pages for COVID, right? COVID-19 injections, but it's built out of that information. And so when you have those things built in such a way, how do you attack that? I mean, you have all of those institutions on your side. You have law in place. You have people that are already accommodating for the general public. How do you then decide that I'm all of a sudden really special, that I don't get my accommodation?
Exactly. A term that I haven't used very much, but really applies here is you're talking about vaccination disability, right? And it's right. A disability like any other disability. You can't have further vaccines, or you can't have vaccines if you think there's any chance you might be injured by them. It's a true disability. I have it. I can never be vaccinated again because I was vaccine disabled and brain damaged in the 1990s.
In the 2008 amendments, I'll give you an example of one. One of the areas of injury is abnormal cell growth. If something can cause, affect, create, injure with abnormal cell growth, then you're in the ballpark there. Okay, abnormal cell growth. What happens when you put spike protein in somebody, and you put in all of these other really bad things that are in, graphene oxide, and you put in, polyethylene glycol, polysorbates, and you put in the aluminums and the mercuries, and all of a sudden, do you have normal cell growth when you're actually now an incubator of creating spike protein? Does something just change here?
That's right.
So much so that it boggles the mind. But at the end of the day, they were very, I think, had really great forethought in terms of expanding all of the areas that could potentially be there. And so much so that it wasn't even in the exhaustive list, as they put it. It's not the exhaustive list. There's more to it than that.
Okay, got it. So, Dr. Bill, let's say I'm a parent. I have grown kids. I don't have K through 12 students anymore, but let's say I'm a mom of a K through 12 student and I feel that they've already been vaccine injured or they would be at high risk of being injured by vaccines. And I come to you and get an ADA waiver. Let's say my child goes to a private school or has just been accepted at a private school. How does the process work?
Well, just like a regular office, only this is not state related. This is a consultation, right? So we're not in a state related office, but you can have a consultation as it relates to the ADA anywhere. And so you would have your consultation, your healthcare provider would evaluate you with a whole list of parameters that are really important as it relates to satisfying those requirements, if you will. And once that's all put together and done, then you would have your request for a waiver to vaccination in writing in different forms. And you also have a list of instructions that help you understand, because you're not an expert, right?
Right.
And you're not us. So that help you understand kind of what to do, how to do it, all right? So
Okay,
that you're not out there just floundering. Okay?
So wait, let me stop there so everybody understands. So you do an intake appointment with Frontline Health Advocates. You get set up with an appointment with a medical doctor who's an evaluator to make sure that the child really does have a disability that would qualify. And then you get a legal letter that's generated from the legal team to help you. And then you also get a set of instructions about how to make this work. Did I get it right?
No, you're close. So
Okay.
the legal piece is woven into the medical piece. The medical piece satisfies the requirements under the ADA laws in terms of what are required from the healthcare provider. Remember, you have a lot of different kinds of providers that can do the work, but you have to satisfy many different things for that to be proper. And then you have the language that's inserted there so that people understand that you're dealing with the ADA. You're not dealing with the state process, because we don't do that. We're not involved with that at all. And so you have a distinctly different animal, just like if you needed, wheelchair access to someplace and you need to let them know, hey, I need to get access over here, whatever. So that's all custom built, put together, after years of refining and building the process. Again, to help the other side and help them understand their responsibilities and requirements under the federal law, and then help the new person who's qualified to understand they're going to be invoking their rights also, and understand that, now I have these rights, these civil rights that are guaranteed, whether it's 504, ADA, whichever route I'm taking, so that I should logically assume that they're going to follow the law, okay, and my rights are going to be protected. And we help the other side understand what those are.
Okay, and the other side is the school. And so I take this as a parent to the school. This doesn't go in the anti-vaxxer CAIR-ME database. I'm a parent. I just take it to the school and deliver it to the school nurse or the principal. Who do I deliver it to?
So we give all of that into the instructions that that they have, because there's a cascade, if you will, right? So if you reach out and you've decided to go to the nurse route, who's usually on the side of only thinking about vaccine exemptions in the state because she's not trained at all in the ADA. And then all of a sudden she's, no, you got to go through this. Well, how come that you're discriminating? I don't even know what that means as a nurse at the school, right? But they're also trained and taught to go and get that to the principal. If nobody else knows, the principal's supposed to know that you got to handle ADA protected individuals different, okay, and uniquely different because of the federal laws. Or maybe you need to go to the district superintendent because he doesn't know anything there. So there's a cascade in a way that we educate in how to do that process so that you can try to get to somebody who understands not to trample on your civil rights.
Okay, but under no circumstances does this get entered into the CAIR-ME system. I understand that.
It has nothing to do with the state mandated system has nothing to do with the ADA. They're like oil and water. They have nothing to do with each other.
Right. Okay, and so I know that this is handled differently, whether it's a private school, religious school, or public school. There's probably the most success where at private schools or religious schools and less so at California public schools. Can you describe what happens in those cases?
Well, I think you should start with what should happen. So
okay, let's start there.
If you're in a public school and somebody comes with a accommodation request for an ADA disability, I can't take a vaccine because the risk of an adverse event or harm is too great based on X, right? the way it's supposed to happen in the public system, and it happens all over the country properly every day, but not in all places, is that they go, oh, I understand, you need an accommodation. I can read, and it says this is what I'm supposed to do, which is give you an accommodation to that, put that in the file as opposed to something else, and move on. And you're now exempted because I'm following the law, which is I'm supposed to grant the accommodation unless I qualify for the outs, which they don't qualify for. And then you have other areas. You mentioned religious. So religious is unique in that in 2008, while it wasn't the primary, and with the ADA in 1990, religious schools were granted an exception to the ADA for a couple of reasons, but it wasn't updated in 2008 to be expansive. Okay, and it was basically, how can we retrofit all these, religious institutions that may be very old into today's ADA standards and be forced to do that and put us out of business to try to do it, right? And so behind the scenes, and you can reach back and get some of the information, but there was a deal cut that basically, all right, well, then you guys are going to be exempted from that piece, right, of forcing you to change your institutions, which means following the ADA. It really wasn't about taking away the protections. It was about money, and we can't afford to do a thing, right?
Right. And we're
so,
thinking about old churches and physical disabilities,
right,
like a wheelchair having to get into an old church, which would ruin
right,
the original structure.
right,
But it was overinterpreted, right?
Right. And so it was overinterpreted, and people think, well, then that was maybe updated in 2008, which it wasn't. Right. So, but there are many important distinctions, because the law is codified to give them an out. It's not there for the regular public school, right? But it's there for the religious school. We get a lot of people through the religious because they can, again, read, and then there are a lot of reasons why. If you take federal money as a religious school, which many and a lot and most, you could say a lot of them do, then all of a sudden you fall into the 504 category, because if you take federal money, you have to follow federal guidelines. Now all of a sudden your out just went away.
Yeah,
Okay?
then the religious schools are no longer exempt. And isn't that true? So they can take federal money, they're not exempt from the ADA. If they take state money, they're not exempt from the ADA, right?
Right. If they're taking, I'm aware of the federal side pretty well. The states are, a cadre of different cobbled togethers. But at the end of the day, if you're taking assistance money, you now have to follow the guidelines. Okay, and you don't get that out anymore. So there's a series of those that are important, because many of the lions of parents that want to deal with these bad actors will go after them, because they're taking money and they're doing things that remove their potential religious exemption, and now all of a sudden these guys are not in compliance. Now they're discriminating for real, and some of these parents take them on and they take them to task, and then they get them turned around. They go, yeah, we don't want to fight this fight. What do we have to do to get out of this fight again? Check the box. When you raise the bar high enough, right, we're after a result. We want people to be protected. And so our attorneys, are very good at helping to, pull that kind of information together as part of, here's maybe the pressure point list of ways to deal with bad actors that aren't following federal law.
Yeah, and I know that you've strengthened those pushback methods backed up by the law. I know you can make a complaint to the Office of Civil Rights, to the DOJ, the licensing board for the school. I mean, there's so many ways you can push back now to make them capitulate, right?
There's a lot of them, and we have a pretty good list of those. I mean, you can even complain to their insurance company and let them know that they're discriminating. Well, does an insurance company want to pay a discrimination claim?
That's a
Do
good
they
one.
have any influence over their client? I mean, you could literally, there are so many ways to bring pressure to bear, but you have to be that lion to want to go and say, I'm going to dig into this when you have bad actors. Now, is that most of the time? No, but we're people out there that are uninformed, that have personal bias, or they're being paid to be a gatekeeper. Let's say in accounting, the bigger counties in, say, California are the bigger problems, because they'll have like a nurse whose job it is to make sure everybody's in compliance, right? Our nurse ratchet person. She's got to make sure everybody's in compliance with that vaccine mandate, CAIR-ME database, and then it comes, it smells different than that. We're going to get rid of them, right? it's kind of that kind of mentality that we run into sometimes, but it's really just the law. When you follow it in its purest sense, surely shouldn't have any challenges here.
Exactly.
And that's why it's very successful, either in its front end or as you build your case as you go along, because at some point they realize, who's on your side again? Oh yeah, I've got all these other institutions, and you have who, right?
Exactly. Well, I want to just go over one more aspect of this ADA waiver, and then we're going to talk about the solution that we're working on as Free Now Foundation with the Disability Rights LLC attorneys, which is really exciting. But I want people to understand that this works. It still works in public school, private school, and religious schools, although it can be adversarial. It's not always adversarial. And then you told me something about some of the public schools in a more rural area, maybe smaller school districts, you just said, or maybe I think one time you said an older principal, they're more likely to understand the ADA and accept the waiver, right?
Well, when you have a lot of experience on the job, right, and you understand that you've had to accommodate for, disabilities, right? So you kind of have the basic understanding of how it's supposed to work. You're more likely to make, I think, the decisions on the appropriate accommodations when you have a little more understanding of how things work. If you're newer to the job and you don't know much about how the law works, the only thing you know is that you got a nurse telling you got to go one way, and you don't know anything about anything else. And that's also why we put a lot of effort into educating, because we want to educate the other side to understand their role, their job, following the federal system to not discriminate against civil rights.
That's exactly right. And now we can talk about how much hope there is, because as you said, when we started out this topic of the ADA waiver, you said like this is how it should work. And how it should work, as you said, is you go to the school, you hand it to the quote unquote governing authority, which I think might be the principal. And then they just take it because it's based on the ADA and they have to. But unfortunately, there is pushback and it's adversarial, but we want to change that. And that's why we have a lawsuit at Free Now Foundation, working with disability rights attorneys and with the attorney of record, Jessica Barsotti, who's been the attorney of record on a lot of our successful lawsuits, like the ones that caught California schools unlawfully mandating COVID shots. And we got that turned around thanks to Jessica. She's the lead attorney on this case. So this case, we expect success with this case probably next year. And we expect that to totally change the situation. And when we win, it would mean that it does work exactly how Dr. Bill said it should work. You go to the school, you give it to them, and they say, yes, that's it. Do you have any, tell us a little bit more about your hope for this case, Dr. Bill?
Well, not every law has had its day in court, okay? And so laws are written, and then they get tested. And so sometimes you need to test the law, and you need to go and get the thing tested so they realize that, Severs versus Smith case showed that you prevail if you go against it in this way, whatever language you're going to use. But at the end of the day, that case law can become very important as you move forward to battle bad actors. So it's really another nail. It's not that the law changed. It's not like the ADA changed. I mean, most people really recognize that the ADA is the law of the land. And what's the thing called? The supremacy clause, right? I mean, the state doesn't, the tail doesn't wag the dog here. The feds are the ones that are in charge here with all of the mechanisms in place. And so how are you going to fight that and actually win? You got to supersede, all of those things that we mentioned earlier and somehow come out on top. These things are written so that they're really going to be in favor of the injured, not for these people that want to complain and be bad actors.
I agree. And it seems like we're asking a very simple question of the courts, which is, are schools exempt from the ADA? And everybody knows the answer to that is no, right?
Right. Yeah, it's pretty academic unless you're being a bad actor. For
right.
Whatever your reason might be, and you've decided that you have a personal bias, you're not well trained. Okay, so what else can it be? Bias, not well trained. So you don't really know how ADA is supposed to work. Okay, so we're going to give you that, but we're going to help you because we tell you what you're supposed to do. So really, what's your excuse for being a bad actor?
I love it.
Where you go.
I think that's exactly how we should think about it. So, Dr. Bill Lionberger, thank you so much for coming on the Alix Mayer Show today. Do you have any last words you want to leave people with today?
Well, I just think that in the current environment that we find ourselves, where there are also bad actors that bring these things into our world and our environment. In the realm of vaccines, there's no safe vaccine. Okay, the double-blind placebo studies don't exist when you go and you do the real work. All right, and now they're moving those over to be messenger RNA type of vaccines. That's where they're headed with all of them. So we already know and knew that these were dangerous, shouldn't be in humans. They're a bioweapon, and they're poison, basically. And so the parents have every right to not only be suspect and concerned and want to seek ways to protect their children, but there's no efficacy and benefit to them when you look at the real stats and data. So you're actually much safer to not vaccinate, i.e., go look at populations in the country that don't vaccinate at all, and you're much safer when you don't. So parents again are like, the red lines in the sand is going off again, and now you're looking to change them all over to messenger RNA. A further reason to be suspect.
I couldn't agree more, Dr. Bill. I see a future where they try to put all the children's vaccines into one mRNA syringe, and then it becomes perhaps a monthly or quarterly vaccination of your child from 0 to 18. And we already saw the destruction of what mRNA does to the human body. It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And the numbers bear it out. The amount of injured death that we have exceeds, in the United States, just from the COVID side, exceeds all the major wars in the last, 65, 75 years. I mean, by a magnitude.
I just saw that statistic. The deaths from COVID shots exceed the deaths of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam all together.
Right.
Unbelievable.
That's U.S.
Yeah.
And worldwide, the number is really huge. But, you can't get the legacy media to want to cover that, right? Because who pays their ad budget?
That's right. They don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. Well, listen, Dr. Bill Lionberger, where can we find your great work?
You can find the work that we do at frontlinehealthadvocates.com. And that's where you have a portal of entry into who we are and what we do.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for developing this way around the unlawful mandates in California. It is such a boon to the children and families of California. I can't thank you enough. And thank you for understanding the cause of vaccine safety and vaccine injury.
And Alix, thank you for wanting to cover it. It's a critically important subject, and I'm really happy that you went there with me today.
Thanks. I think we got a great show today. All right. Thanks again.
All right.
We are so happy to have as our prime sponsor, Mish International, Northern California's acclaimed specialists in rare coins and gold and silver investments. Our friend and supporter, Robert Mish, is the same principal that started the company back in 1963, and he's still there every day with 63 years of experience. He has integrity, reliability, and fair pricing, whether you're buying or selling. When you have business to do with precious metals, you'll always be treated well at Mish International. Call 650-324-9110 and tell Robert that Alix sent you.